What was Abraham Lincoln's greatest legacy? Saving the Union? Ending slavery? Expanding federal power? Or something even larger? Because wars do not merely determine who wins, they determine what comes afterward. And according to the real Lincoln, the most enduring consequences of the Civil War was not simply military victory, but the creation of a fundamentally different American state. By 1865, the Confederacy had collapsed. The Union had prevailed. Slavery was dying. But victory raised a new question. What would happen next? How would the South be reintegrated? What would freedom mean? And who would decide? Because winning a war and shaping the peace are not the same thing. For many Americans, Lincoln represents national unity, the preservation of the Republic, and the destruction of slavery. These achievements alone have secured his place among the nation's greatest presidents. But according to Thomas DiLorenzo, another legacy emerged as well. A much stronger central government, one whose authority would increasingly overshadow that of the states. In this interpretation, the Civil War marked a constitutional turning point, not merely a military victory, but the triumph of a new understanding of American government. And with the victory came Reconstruction, an enormous task. 4 million formerly enslaved people were entering freedom. Southern society had been devastated. Political institutions had collapsed. Economic life had been shattered. The question was no longer, how do we win, but how do we rebuild? But Lincoln himself would not live to see most of that process. Assassinated in April of 1865, many of the struggles that would define Reconstruction would unfold after his death, which raises an important question. How much of the Reconstruction belongs to Lincoln, and how much belongs to those who inherited the nation he left behind? Historians continue to debate that question, but according to the real Lincoln, the larger transformation set in motion by the war would continue long after Lincoln himself was gone. Different answers emerged. Some believed Reconstruction should be moderate. Others believed the South required a more sweeping transformation. Some emphasized reconciliation. Others emphasized justice. Some sought national healing. Others feared that old systems and attitudes would simply reassert themselves. These tensions would define the post-war era, and they remain subjects of historical debate even today. And this is where Thomas DiLorenzo arrives at his broader conclusion. For DiLorenzo, the most lasting consequence of Lincoln's presidency was not simply the defeat of the Confederacy. It was the transformation of the American system itself. Before the Civil War, many Americans thought of the Union as a compact among several states. The federal government was important, but limited. After the war, that understanding had changed. Succession had been settled by force. The authority of the national government stood above the states, and according to DiLorenzo, the United States increasingly moved away from the decentralized republic envisioned by Jefferson and toward a more consolidated nation-state. In his view, Reconstruction completed that process. Federal authority expanded, Washington's power grew, and a constitutional order that had existed for generations was permanently altered. To DiLorenzo, that transformation was Lincoln's greatest legacy, not merely preserving the Union, but redefining it. But perhaps the deeper issue is not simply Reconstruction itself. It is the relationship between war and political change, because throughout history, wars often produce more than military victories. They create new institutions, new expectations, new concentrations of power. What began as emergency can become permanence. This has become a recurring theme throughout this series. Emergency powers, suspension of liberties, total war, and now Reconstruction. Each raises the same question. Once extraordinary powers are used, do they truly disappear, or do they become part of the structure that follows? What struck me reading these chapters is not that history produces easy heroes or villains. It does not. Lincoln acted in extraordinary circumstances, and extraordinary circumstances often produce extraordinary decisions. But history is not only about intentions, it is also about consequences, and consequences sometimes outlive the people who created them. And this is where the story reaches its final stage, because the war to preserve the Union was only the beginning. Victory had answered one question, but another remained. What kind of nation would emerge from the ruins? For DiLorenzo, that question mattered even more than the outcome of the war itself, because Reconstruction was not merely about rebuilding cities, it was about defining the character of the Union itself. Perhaps that is why Reconstruction remains so controversial, because the debate was never only about the South, or even about Lincoln himself. It was about the nature of the American Union. Was the United States primarily a federation of states, or a single nation? Had the war preserved the founder system, or transformed it? And according to the real Lincoln, the answer offered by Thomas DiLorenzo is clear. The war did not merely save the Union, it created a new one, a more centralized Union, a more powerful federal government, and a constitutional order from which there would be no return. Whether one regards that outcome as necessary, as tragic, or even beneficial is another question, but in DiLorenzo's view, that was the ultimate legacy of Abraham Lincoln, not merely preserving the Union, but fundamentally redefining it. Abraham Lincoln's legacy remains one of the most debated in American history. To some, he preserved the Union and destroyed slavery. To others, he transformed the constitutional order itself. Perhaps both statements contain some truth, because history rarely offers simple answers. It offers tensions, trade-offs, and consequences that outlive the crises that produced them. And perhaps that is why Abraham Lincoln remains one of the most debated figures in American history. More than a century and a half later, Americans are still arguing about the meaning of Abraham Lincoln, and perhaps that, more than anything else, is the measure of his legacy. I'll see you in the next episode.